Welcome everyone to 52 Living Ideas. Tonight, we are doing the Divine Feminine, and we are closing out our study of Isabella Price book, Awakening the Goddess Within. And I don't think I said that right, um, but we are concluding on that study. And so what we're going to do tonight is Brian's going to do his presentation, and then we're going to watch segments of a video. I apologize for the late start. What we did was we had to just figure out some technical things, and so we're here now. So Brian, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Okay, thank you. Yes, this has been quite a journey for at least for me, and I believe for Evanique and Penny. I hope it's also been interesting for the participants. I know David's attended often. I hope he's benefited from it. We've been looking at the concept of the divine feminine, which was first raised by Evanique in the figure of Mary Magdalene. And then other people showed a keen interest in that, as did I. And then Penny joined in to help put together the presentation. We looked at several books. Really, we read and studied several books before we settled on the book by Isabella Price, Goddess Power. Because she didn't come to this, she didn't start out coming to this with a political feminist agenda or any other agenda. For example, there was another person who wrote, Edward Dodge, who actually studied the history of marijuana around the world, ancient history of marijuana around the world, and discovered that the goddess was very much tied up with cannabis. And so he wrote a very good treatise, an extensive, I think, well done treatise on the history of the goddess, worldwide history of the goddess. But again, he came from a certain, perspective, and although I thought it was really very, very well done, we settled on Isabella Price's because I thought she was really focusing on the image or the concept of the divine feminine in of itself from the beginning, based on her background, and that would probably be most interesting to a larger group. That doesn't preclude discussions of other topics, and that's certainly, we're invited to do that this evening, because this is a wrap up, and one of the points that Isabella Price means is that we need to she feels that we need to bring the divine feminine into modern life. It needs to be instantiated. I think that's Jordan Peterson words, but instantiated, embodied in modern life, implicitly and explicitly, more than it is being done these days. So I'm inviting each of you, and throughout the series, I've invited people to talk about what the goddess means to you in your life today, or what it could mean to you in your life today, individual, social, cultural, religious, political, any and all of that. Now, when I say goddess, that's already creating a framework that looks at personifications of the divine feminine. And again, that's something that Isabella Price embraces as a useful point of entry for understanding, discussing, and bringing to life the divine feminine, but that's not really the end of it. That's kind of the beginning. So those are some of the points actually are going to come out today in our discussion. What I have for the wrap up is a video interviewing Isabella Price, and I thought it was very well done. When I went to prepare my wrap up, my summary, it's one of the things I looked at, and I realized that it couldn't be, I could not have done better than the person who did this interview. In addition, I also thought a video interview would be great for a wrap-up because it's a chance to see, and if you will, virtually meet Isabella Price in person. She will be talking in this interview directly to us, answering the questions from the interviewer, Bernard Alvarez. His background is that he's one of the hosts on a let's call it a radio channel. It's kind of a chat channel, and he has what's called a pagan background, and so you might hear references to that in some of his questions. He lives in South Florida. Please don't dismiss the idea of the pagan. Basically everything we've studied in this book has been pagan except for Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene, because it's in a context other than the Christian religion. I'll also give a shout out in that regard to the Green Man and our new king, or England's new King Charles III, I think it is. On his invitation to the coronation, the image he chose was the image of the Green Man, which is that's actually a pagan image. It existed in Northern Europe, but it also existed in the Middle East. It started, as far back as I know, it started with Dumuzi, who was the brother, husband, and consort of Inanna, one of the very first goddesses in written history. And this is a very powerful archetype or image that has been preserved through all of written history. It arose in many different cultures. Pan is considered a re-embodiment of him. Dionysius. I'm not so familiar with all the European folklore and mythology, but the Green Man, I believe, also arose independently there. So that's a pagan image really in conjunction with the divine feminine that he shows for his the cover of his invitation. Maybe because he's interested in environmental matters. I'm not quite sure why. Okay, I have a PowerPoint that'll give us some orientation, and then we'll get right into the video. What let's see, am I going to pull that up here? Yeah, I'm going to try to pull that up. Okay. All right, does everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay, for some reason I don't see it, but all right, that's okay. Oh yeah, I do see it now too. The divine feminine we need now. That is the point of this interview, and really the bottom line for Isabella, after she spent most of this book talking about the history. Again, it's offered up as a point of entry. The interview is with, it's an online interview with Isabella, and I just want to make that clear from the beginning so you'd understand the format you're going to be looking at. And what the substance of the interview is really Isabella Price's reflections on her book, Goddess Power. It's the book we've been reading, so it's a great way to wrap up. There are 4 parts of the presentation. I start out with a reminder of the reason we're doing this series, at least from my perspective, the intent, and then a little bit the reminder of some of the aspects of the divine feminine which have come to us through our study of traditions and history. That's kind of a primer to get you into the mindset to think about the divine feminine, what it might look like, or how it might manifest itself today. There's a very brief introduction I've written to Isabella, and then I give a list of 6 topics that are going to be addressed in the interview. They're basically 6 questions. Bernard had a very good interview based on these questions, and I've decided just to follow some of them, not all of them. So my intent now, we will view the 6 interview segments individually. And after seeing each segment, I will offer up a summary reminder of what's in Isabella Price's substantive points. So that might be, if it finds out that that's redundant and tedious, then I just won't do that. But I do have that as a way of prompting and promoting, priming discussion and comment. Because the bottom line here is hopefully to have some discussion about the perspective that each of you brings to these insights that Isabella Price is offering. So what are the benefits of the divine feminine in other words, this series? Just taking time to recognize, acknowledge, understand, accept, appreciate, and I love the other words covered up, and respect the divine feminine in and of itself, without being embodied in everyday life. To raise awareness and express gratitude for the divine feminine, which obviously is related to the previous. To provide a forum for participants to participate. So that's been a focus throughout. And then finally, to understand the divine feminine's significance and potential for contemporary religion, spirituality, and all aspects of contemporary life, both in her presence and absence. In other words, the fact that in some ways she's been suppressed has had significance in contemporary life, and that's also worth contemplating. But this last point this is really what I believe Isabella Price would like us to focus on in our discussion of this interview. Her book is a lot about history. It was all very fascinating, but now she really is trying to turn the page and get us to think about what the divine feminine might mean for each of us in our lives. All right, let's see. And here are some of the aspects of the divine feminine that have come out from the study. Goddess quests, which I thought was really, and there are a lot of goddess quests in, people call it mythology, but it used to be worldwide religions. I'd call them wisdom traditions. And it was very interesting to bring that out because in today's life, people are focusing a lot on the hero journey, which is individual quests, but usually undertaken, at least in the mythologies, undertaken by men. It's equally and then when they're discussed in modern philosophy and elsewhere, there often is the focus on the hero rather than the different goddess quests. Something that I think is important is the sacred marriage, something that really is not highlighted much in other contexts. That's, for example, Isis and Osiris, Inanna and Dumuzi, and many, many other examples that we've studied in this book. As it says at the very bottom of this slide, the divine feminine tends to be more inclusive rather than exclusive in its approach. It's looking for balance and harmony, and so seeks to incorporate what people consider to be the masculine together with the feminine that she embodies. One of the key points that I thought came out in the history was the intergenerational transition. The women are often involved in these mythologies, and the goddesses are often involved as facilitating, smoothing transitions in life. And that's a point that Isabella will bring out in her comments here. And then there's the divine feminine has a greater focus on nature and emotions than we tend to find in patriarchal religions, and as some would argue, other elements of contemporary society. So all of these things are if you will, dimensions or aspects of the divine feminine, we might keep in mind that they might trigger some thoughts for you as we listen to the interview. So Isabella's life work, it has not been this book. Isabella's life work has been a series of books called One Truth, Many Paths. And this was, her approach was first inspired by her childhood experiences in Switzerland and Italy. Switzerland being rather secular and Italy more religious in a formal kind of way. Also inspired by her studies in India and her later life in California. So here we have, there's 2 countries in Europe, India, which obviously is a very large continent. I'm not quite sure what part she was in, but she did have a teacher there when she was there. And then through her later life in California, she fell in with a community of people very interested in the divine feminine. So she, again, in this video, she raises important questions about contemporary life that point to the importance of a new beginning. And let's see, with that, I think we are ready. I'll just say there are 6 segments. We're going to start by defining the divine feminine. One of the stories she repeats is the story of history of Isis, which I think is worth repeating, so I'll play that. Then the importance of the divine feminine today, that's really a key element of this interview. Why the divine feminine, the next segment, why the divine feminine is insufficiently manifest today. I also think that's very important to understand why and how that happened. Then the sacred marriage, which in a lot of the mythologies, it's a union of cosmic forces. Isabella Price she's not dismissing that, but she's also suggesting that it can be seen as the sacred marriage as a union of psychic forces within each of us. And then finally, she touches on a couple of the pitfalls for manifesting the divine feminine today. And I guess it's not a spoiler alert, I'll just say what those are. Number 1 is don't associate too much the masculine and feminine with male and female humans. You can have a male that's both all males have both masculine and feminine parts. Females have both masculine and feminine parts to their psyche. And then the other part is don't get lost in the history and traditions. That's just the beginning. We need to think about enlivening the divine feminine in our lives. So let's see. Yeah, we are ready for the first segment, which is on what is the divine feminine. And that runs for about 3 minutes.
All right, Brian, you can stop sharing your screen.
Revolution Radio.
Oh, is my time?
Live from the heart of the Blue
Can you hear it?
Roanoke, Virginia.
All right, then I've got it. Wow, I couldn't get this to work earlier. All right, let me get there.
Of humanity's history, being that we have been patriarchal for thousands of years, and the goddess and the divine feminine has been suppressed for so long, we are starting to see a little bit of a reemergence of the divine feminine and a much needed balance being brought up to the forefront. We've seen it with a return of the neo-pagan movement, a lot of the indigenous cultures, as well as other goddess-oriented spiritual practices and beliefs. So, Isabella, to you, what is your definition of the divine feminine and or the goddess?
Yes, great question. Well, I would say the divine feminine for me is both form and formless. She's immanent in all of creation. spirit and flesh are one in goddess religion. And at the same time, she also transcends everything. She's both and of so-called, physical birthation. And so basically, as I mentioned briefly before, she comes under many different names. She's known under many symbols and manifestations. And I also was circling, with a pagan community for several years after moving to California, where we honored all her different facets and symbols. And it was non-denominational, which I loved because it was equally respectful of all the wisdom traditions. So for me, the divine feminine, again, is all of that. And yet, it ultimately, in its essence, it's one. She is one. And so it's, I think the form is very important for us to engage perhaps in devotional practice to create, connection to her, because, we are visual. We want to see an icon. It helps us as an entry point to tune into her energetically. But we also need to be careful to not get too much attached to her form, because, as I said, she also transcends form. And when you look, for instance, at the Shakta tradition in India, some of the dark-skinned goddesses there, like Kali, you have a very interesting symbolism. They are Shakti, and Shakti is really the cosmic life force. It's the creative, vital force that courses through all of us, in all our expressions. And so the Shakti is really transpersonal. So that's why I'm saying we should not get overly identified and attached to some pre-modern conceptions of the divine feminine, the goddess, although they are a very important entry point and an important tool to deepen our connection to the divine feminine if we feel her calling. It's, of course, not everybody's spiritual path.
Okay, let me just see now. This is new territory for me. Oopsie. I need to go to the 9th slide. How am I going to do that? There it is. Okay. So the first topic was how do you define the can everybody hear me? You hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Is how to define the divine feminine. And some of the points she made is that she has been understood, conceived, and worshipped in many different forms in different cultures over time, but she is one. She is form and formless. She is the cosmic life force, the transformational energy, which is nicely embodied in the Shakti, which is a force or I don't want to say a character, I guess a goddess or diva from the Hindu tradition. The wisdom traditions of various cultures are only entry points. We should not become attached to the forms which have embodied the divine feminine in the past. And it's much needed today to restore balance. And I added the word health in individual society and on earth. The suppression of the divine feminine is the imbalance and the sickness. I added that. Are there any other, would anybody else, there's a little comment there from me at the end. Would anybody else like to comment?
All right. If anybody has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat. We'll give it about 30 seconds. Just one little comment for me, Brian, is I always think of the Louis Sullivan form follows function. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in the forms being the goddesses that we forget that the divine feminine energy is formless, and we all have both masculine and feminine energy. And I think it's not gender, but it's, and I just want people to keep in mind that it's not gender related. It's just different types. Like a masculine energy is a planner, and the feminine energy is creative, and that one is not above the other, but that when both are in harmony with each other, you have this place where you can have creative things happen. And then when you have those creative things happen in harmony, then great things happen. So that's what I wanted to add.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Well, I would like to say, as I've gone through this interview and prepared for this presentation, a couple points have hit me or struck me. Evanique's touched on them. The first I've mentioned in the slide already. I think the key element is the suppression of what we call the divine feminine. And the divine feminine, if again, that's a label, it's a characterization, it's an embodiment, it's a way to think about and certain values and principles and forces in the world, which over time people have come to see or characterized as feminine. We'll have a bit more on that in the slides later. And the more I think about it, the more I think that a key element, this is not all of it, but a key element of all of this is the manner in which these characteristics, now called the divine feminine, were suppressed. They were violently suppressed. So there was a transformation, and then these forces that she embodied were forcibly excluded from institutions, different spheres of life. And that is, I think, maybe the whole problem. That leads to the imbalance, that leads to the sickness that we're experiencing. It is the violent suppression. And I think that is characterized as masculine, the violent suppression, and maybe, rightfully or wrongfully so, but let's set aside the characterization. I think the problem is the violent and forceful suppression. And that the feminine offers, the divine feminine, is just another option for transformation. It's not suppression, and it's not violent. It's more of an evolution, more of a nurturing. And I think that really is a very big part of the role of what we call the divine feminine. If we had more evolutionary, gentle transformations rather than violent, coercive transformations, the world would be a better place. There'd be more balance, there'd be more harmony, there'd be more health. And incidentally, people would give credit to the feminine, I think, for achieving that.
Thank you, Brian. Up next, I have Penny.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say like 2 points. First, the point that, there were many historical manifestations and even present day, like Mother Mary, of basically the divine feminine. And her point that really these are just different symbols, representations for one force. It's all unified. And the second, which I would say, kind of the point Brian was making about the suppression, I would say that, to me, the synthesis of it is that females were associated with the divine feminine. And when they suppressed the divine feminine, they suppressed females. So the basic secondary category of women in most societies throughout the entire world today was a result of this suppression. And many of the characteristics that were considered feminine were considered less worthy and unimportant from the viewpoint of the social structure. And so, this has created a great imbalance, because the qualities that women would be able to, or the feminine in general, would be able to bring to society, have not been looked upon with favor, have been malaligned, have been, really overlooked. And we have ended up with a very imbalanced society. And just one thing is, the divine feminine, one of the main representations was the Mother Earth, Gaia, who supports all mankind and all creatures, all life forms in the world. But the patriarchic religions thought that the man was the dominance over the world. And so he could do whatever he wanted with the world. And so there has been a lack, especially we can see now, as we have taken several centuries of this, of respect for the earth and what really needs to be maintained to sustain the earth as a living force. And so it's just been the source of a lot of problems, I think, in society. And if they would reintegrate some of these, the respect and the feminine in society, it would correct a lot of social problems.
Thank you, Penny. Brian, we don't have anybody else in the comments, so if you want to move on.
Yeah, I would just say one thing on this first slide. There's a lot of points here. Basically, the first three paragraphs would apply to reflections on any divine force. You could say this about male gods as well as female gods. Male gods have been understood, conceived, and worshipped in many different forms. People see them as both form and formless. And but they can be seen as an entry point. So a lot of these comments, yes, I think they're true, but they're not true just exclusively for the feminine. I think the thing that is exclusively true is the last point, in my opinion. Okay, so let's go. Let's see if I can get this going.
Revolution.
All right, we're going to go to the next question, which is the story and history of Isis, which is, it's really, to me, an example of it's clearly an example of the goddess quest, nurturing, diligence, and the way that the goddess assists with transformation, both preserving the past and providing for the future. So let me try to get that set up.
Radio proudly presents live from
And for that matter, what are some of
Yeah.
the more well-known goddesses, I guess in our Western culture, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I would say, definitely I think Isis has been actually very popular since you mentioned her until, the late Roman period when Christianity became the official state religion after Constantine, and then all her temples and the priestesses were literally shut down because, of course, it was considered pagan and not compatible with the official Christian doctrine. So ISIS has had a considerable influence on Western culture, going back to the Greco-Roman period, which, laid the foundation. And by the way, just quickly, she's also a great role model for us as a goddess woman who was incarnate. And, you probably know the story of the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. And, her husband was killed and his body parts were scattered all over Egypt. And so Isis experienced this deep grief that we humans all go throughout our life. Suffering is always part of it, and we grow in suffering. And as we go through the dark night journey of the soul, we all know we can, attain healing, and we can wake up more fully as a result of that. And so she shows us that it's okay to tune deeply into that grief and to cry out. And she searched for Osiris all over Egypt, wailing and crying. And in Egypt, they still do this ritual at funerals, which is very interesting in our so-called modern times. So she shows that, how to get in touch with also the pain in us rather than bypassing it or, trying to resist it, because we know that's not working. And then she eventually finds Osiris. She retrieves, the body parts, and she revives him again with her wings, because, as you know, she takes on the form of a bird, a soul bird at times. And so he's able to be reborn or resurrects, and then becomes the lord of the death, of the underworld, the realm of the shadows. And she also, assists him in that function, giving hope to the deceased that they will attain immortality. So the whole resurrection theme that we find in Christianity is very ancient and has roots in a lot of these pre-Christian cultures and mythic narratives. And so, but Isis is a very empowered goddess woman. That's why she's an interesting role model, I think, for us today. Not only is she able to feel her pain and work through it, she also revives Osiris. She doesn't give up. She searches for him. She's persistent, and she's highly intelligent. She employs her reason to, find him and trick others into returning him to her.
Right.
So we can all draw inspirations from her qualities.
Wonderful.
I just wanted to elaborate on that.
Thank you. Isabella, we have a commercial.
Let's see now. Hopefully I can go. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So this is a summary of the story and history of ISIS. It's obviously very brief story. I don't think it's not the history of these wisdom traditions is not the focus of this interview, but I thought it was worthwhile to hear one of them. Again, it might trigger thoughts with some of you. The points that were made is that ISIS was popular throughout the Roman Empire until Constantine established the Christian church. It really was quite a change in religious practices with during the reign of Constantine. She experienced grieving and lamentation. She suggests do not resist pain, which in Christian terms, I think can be bear your cross. The Buddhists are also very focused on overcoming suffering. So she definitely has addressed here in her story a topic that's considered central in major world religions. The resurrection of Osiris, he became the king of the afterlife. And she referenced that as being a forerunner of the Christian images, except Osiris he's not in the sky. I think he's under the earth, but he's still king of of life after death. She's an empowered goddess woman. You could delve more into her story to see that, but she's very persistent. The one thing I think that is left out in what Isabella said is that there was a transition that she also shepherded. It's a transition from Osiris, the father, to Horus, the son. Osiris had been the pharaoh together with Isis, and then Horus became the pharaoh, I think, together with Isis until he married. And then his wife became co-pharaoh. This is the god. These are the gods. So, but that's basically how it tended. You know, they're reenacting, if you will, on the divine stage how transitions were handled in Egyptian royalty. But the reason I want to stress that is that I think it's an important point that yes, the goddess is transformations which are non-violent, and she is the one who assists in the transition in a non-violent way from the father to the son. And so I think non-violent transformation is really a key takeaway from these goddess stories. But I would add that it's also true that the men are also involved in transitions from one, if you will, from one goddess to another. For example, in ancient Sumeria, that's going back when Inanna was involved in, the high priestess of Inanna was involved in the annual sacred marriage, and in that context was involved in transitioning from the older king to the younger king. The high priestess did that, but when the high priestess died, you needed to transition from one high priestess to another, and the kings handled that. So it goes both ways. But the key point is, I think, the peaceful transformation is, I think, again, a key element that distinguishes the nature of the goddess stories and histories from the god stories and histories. So that's just one, if you will, that's my comment on this story. Maybe others have a comment.
So if anyone has any questions or comments on this section, you can type exclamation point in the chat. The one thing that, I like that Isabella in the video uses Isis as an example of, the divine feminine. And you're right. I think she still has an influence today in all different types of religions, in all different cultures, in all different areas, because her story is real. Her story is about pain and suffering, and, even though it's not a full resurrection of Osiris, it's about, like you said, Brian, it really is about transformation. And if we're all living life to the full, we're all going to go through all of these stages, and not all of these is going to be pleasant. In the video, she mentions we all go through the dark night of the soul at some point in our time here on earth. And in a sense, in a weird way, it's kind of what you want, because it helps you grow and it helps you transition. And you don't want to stay the same. And I think when you talk about she oversees the transition from Osiris to Horus, her son, it's also about, a transfer of power. But I think one of the things that you gotta realize is that Isis was very powerful, but she wasn't trying to dominate. And I think domination is different than like divine power in a sense. So to me, divine power is something that you have, is something that you exude, but you don't have to force it on anyone. And I think domination, as you were talking about previously, Brian, it's something that's violent, and it's something that eventually will be overthrown. People will be tired of being oppressed, and they will eventually rebel, and you will find out that you don't have that power that you thought you had, because eventually people get tired of it. And I think that's why ISIS has gone throughout the ages, and she's used in all different types of religions, is because of the story of her power. So that's all I have. If anybody else has any other comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat. I don't see anybody, Brian, so whenever you're ready.
Okay. Go back and pick up on the next topic, which is the importance of the divine feminine today. And here, I think this is an important segment to me, because she touches on a lot of the forces that are considered to comprise the goddess. So she's stepping away from some of the forms that she talked about in the beginning, and trying to describe these goddess. The goddess is in her formless nature. So let's see if we can get at that. The importance of the divine feminine today. 1 second.
Revolution Radio, proud.
Our live stream, for those of us who didn't have a chance to look at the cover. It's a beautiful cover, by the way. Thank you.
Thanks.
What would you say? What is? I know that you have a series called "One Truth, Many Paths," and how does this book tie into that?
Yes, thanks for asking. Well, this book is just part of the series. The series honors all wisdom traditions, and the underlying vision is to show that what unites us in our basic humanness is infinitely greater than what divides us. And of course, in the world at large, as you mentioned earlier, we see divide, separation all over the place. So I wanted to specifically also honor the feminine face of the divine, because most studies on comparative religion have pretty much left her out, or if they mention her, it's one little footnote, or perhaps 2-3 little sentences, or at the very best, it's one paragraph. So I wanted to change that, and that prompted me, of course, to write this book. And I was diving into all the research, on some of the great pioneers of the goddess research, like Maria Gimbutas, Eleanor Gaydon, Carol Christ. I mean, I literally devoured all their books, and that was also a major source of inspiration, in addition to, of course, going to Siama and circling with, my koan and honoring the goddess in her many aspects. So again, it's, and right now, and you mentioned, the great crisis and all, the problems that we face, it's obvious we could go down the list endlessly. Right now, I feel that she is truly rising again. So I felt this deep call that this book has to just be written, and it was a process that took many years, and it put me through the crucible. I mean, that would be a whole other subject, but now the timing is very auspicious, I feel, because we need, as you mentioned earlier, we need to balance and integrate the archetypal masculine with the archetypal feminine. We need to reclaim the sacred in both of them so that we can become whole human beings again. And that will, of course, have a ripple effect and lead to healing in the world at large, and also putting ourselves into alignment with Mother Earth, this beautiful planet. So that's what I would say.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And with that being said, what are some of the reasons? I mean, a lot of us are those of us who are aware of the divine feminine might be able to see where her energy is needed on the planet at this time. But for let's say the I don't know, the average everyday masculine man, why what should he be looking for in understanding why we need her energy back on this planet? What are the roles that need to be re-examined and or brought back into manifestation during this time in history?
Yes, great question, Bernard. Thank you. Well, first off, I believe that what we need is the fierce aspect of the divine feminine right now. But it's a fierceness that's rooted in truth and love. That is very important to start off. The other thing is that the values that we find in goddess religion when we go back thousands of years, and perhaps we'll get a chance to dive more deeply into that, are cooperation, partnership, equality, inclusivity, creativity, intuition, playfulness, and sustainability, using natural resources sustainably. And these are values, of course, that, as we know, have been replaced by what I call a very unhealthy masculine or hyper-masculine paradigms that have emerged, roughly, we can say, especially in the late second millennium BC and in the first millennium, when all forms of organized religions became increasingly patriarchal and managed exclusively by men, as we can see, especially also in the three Abrahamic traditions. And we can see it in our world today when we look at, the statistics, and when we look at, the crisis and the exploitation and the absurdity that is being played out on the political level, the income inequality, domination, exploitation, authoritarian power structures, conquest, war-driven systems, political and economic system. I mean, it's everywhere. And of course, the exploitation then goes all the way. I mean, sexual abuse, as we've again witnessed with the whole Me Too movement. And of course, it goes hand in hand with the destruction of Mother Earth and the depletion of her resources. So all of that plays into it. And so these values that I mentioned are really the new paradigms that I believe the mother acts as the evolutionary catalyst to propel us to implement this new vision, what we all yearn to see in our hearts, deep in our hearts, this new world. She acts as the evolutionary catalyst because she's Shakti, the vital life force that works in us, as us, and through us, and propels us to take the next evolutionary leap. Because you know as well as I do, and everybody else on that call, if we don't take it, we are doomed. And I believe it's the fierce mother, and especially the dark-skinned mother, Kali Ma from India is a great example, who puts us through this crucible, these birth pangs that we witness now everywhere, because it's an ugly picture right now. It's tough. It's all the shadow issues come to the surface that have never been processed properly on the individual and, of course, also on the collective levels, just starting with this country, but we see it being played out worldwide. And this is where I believe the Dark Mother comes in. She shatters our illusions. She helps us to overcome our fears so that we can make room for the new emergence, the new paradigms that we all long to see in our world.
Wow, and thank you for that. That was a very clear, concise, and thorough answer, and got me about 20 more questions. But
Okay, can people hear me? Yes, okay. So this, I think, is a key or part of the interview. She's really inviting us to think about, and I'm inviting you to comment on some of the issues or topics she raised. I'll just leave it at that because she said so much. I don't want to go through I will if there aren't a lot of comments, but I'm hoping that this will have triggered some thoughts with people.
If anyone has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. I'll just start it off by saying, like, that part was really powerful. And again, I love how she talks about how we have to integrate, and, really you're seeing it in today's culture, right? The rise of the fierceness of the divine feminine, whereas, and you saw it, I mean, you see it throughout all of history. You can see it in the women's movement in the 60s. And, it's always there and it's always building, and there's always women that are fierce in every era, and they're like laying the tracks for the next generation. And I think I'll just leave it really quick at one thing to say is that all of us really are leaving things for the next generation. What we do today will affect the next generation, which is why I think Isabella is so passionate about it, because we are leaving a legacy, and we are leaving this legacy. And if we, and the cool thing about today is that you see the and you see it throughout history too, the integration of the masculine and feminine, and the, men recognizing that, women aren't equal, and that women should have the same rights as men, and they're fighting for it alongside of us. So I think you see that. I think you see it even in this interview, where the person that's interviewing is the male, and, understanding, and getting the message out about the divine feminine. Because even though it has been suppressed by people who are in power, and I use that word in quotes, it doesn't stop it. So I think that's beautiful. But up next, I have Joe.
Good evening, everyone. I think that she brings up a valid point on a number of levels, and there's some evidence to suggest, empirical evidence to suggest that societies that tend to score higher with, there's a Hofstadter scale that's often used with a lot of businesses, and it's also used in a lot of different studies that talks about the differences between masculinity and femininity. And they go over in detail how in feminine societies, they tend to be much more communal, much more caring, much more basically is they're looking for more equality, things along those lines, and there's a higher level of tolerance. And the countries that are masculine are much more assertive. There's a much more higher score of individualism as well. It's tightly correlated along with that. So with that being said, I think that yes, that some of the things that we've been covering here, as far as a return to the divine feminine and ultimately a respect for the feminine, actually addresses some of the issues that she raised. I think that if you look at the countries on the scale that I was just talking about, the ones that are more feminine are Sweden, Norway, Sweden, Norway, and Latvia. Whereas the ones that are more masculine, or the United States is pretty high, but Hungary and Japan are right at the top. So I think that, and you kind of, again, they provide empirical evidence to suggest that, what are the values of that particular society? And that there are problems whenever there's a lack of balance. I'll just say that. It should be something that we're trying to achieve with, like, the Tao, where it's essentially there's a balance between the two, between the masculine and the feminine. And I think that you see how that plays out in society. How do you reintroduce the feminine into the culture? I think that's a challenge. I think that there's so many variables that go into it that make it difficult to actually help move a country in that direction. I think there's just a lot of other factors that make it difficult to talk about it in that, to come up with an idea on how to introduce the divine feminine again. Anyway, those are just some of my thoughts, and I can put a note to the scale in the chat.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. Brian, do you want to add anything?
Does anybody else have something?
There's nothing in the chat right now, and I don't see anybody with raised hands.
All right, well, I would just call attention to this, what I call the hallmarks on this slide. I think it's still on the screen. The hallmarks of what's called the divine feminine. These are stated by Isabella: cooperation, partnership, equality, inclusivity, creativity, playfulness, intuition, and sustainability. I would also add diversity and tolerance. I think tolerance is really important. If we want to move towards a world that has more feminine qualities like these, I think we need to start, or one way to start, or the start might include not calling them feminine qualities, and just call them that we value and appreciate cooperation, partnership, equality, inclusivity, creativity, playfulness, intuition, and sustainability. We appreciate diversity and tolerance. We practice those things. We appreciate and value them. And I think that would be a big step. And I think that's happening. I think that, I really feel more and more people are not seeing this stuff as just feminine, but as useful, effective, welcome, it helps us thrive and live better, all of these things. And I think there's getting to be more of a, I think there's getting to be more of an appreciation for this in some circles. Not all circles, but I hope that, I think that is one way to start to introduce some of this. Another way, I'll just tell you, I don't remember the man's name, but he was a professor at Stanford University who did studies on stress. And if you look up his
Sapolsky.
What is it?
Robert Sapolsky.
Yeah, Sapolsky. And he put out a video, I think it was in Frontline or somewhere, but he put out a video, and he studied stress in baboon and human cultures. Other people, I think, did more of the human, and but he's aware of that work, and he did work on the baboons. And what he discovered when he started studying, he spent his whole first half of his career studying baboons. In fact, he studied just one particular troop of baboons in Africa, and it turns out that they are a very nasty animal. They are not nice to each other. And it's in the troop, it's the few alpha males that really dominate and abuse the other males and all the females. And he continued to study them because he was interested in the topic of stress. And these alpha males were putting everybody else under a lot of stress. And so that was great for his studies. And he was taking blood samples from all these second-class baboons to see how, and looking at their behaviors to see how the blood chemistry of stress played out in behaviors, lifestyle, lifespan, that sort of thing. And then one year he was devastated because all the alpha males had gotten into a garbage dump at one of the resorts close to where the baboons lived, and all the alpha males died. And they got to eat first, so they're the ones that ate the poisonous stuff. And nobody else, none of the other baboons got to eat any of it. And they all died. And of course, this professor was devastated because now he can't study the impact of the stress caused by alpha males. And so he was very unhappy and kind of depressed about that for a while, until he kept studying the troop, and he realized that once the alpha males were gone, everybody else was much happier. And the troops' behavior changed, individual health improved, and as a group, they did not let anyone else become alpha male type people. They made very clear to all the adolescent males that it's not cool to abuse women or each other. And so that's a tremendous insight. That if we can just somehow rearrange things, I'm not sure we can kill all the alpha males, but in Greece, they were sent out of the country. It wasn't called expatriation. It was called, I forget the word, I'll come back to it. But they had a vote once a year, and they sent out of the country the most powerful man. He had to leave. Alcibiades that was a student of Socrates, had to leave one year. If you ever read about that guy, he's just like Donald Trump. And he went over to Turkey and joined an alliance with the enemies of Athens, and came back and tried to conquer Athens itself. This guy who was expelled from the country, Alcibiades. He's also the guy who's very, self-centered and striving, calculating. He's the one, you might have heard about the Platonic love. That was really, the ideas that, and there is something to this in the Greek practice, that older males would shepherd younger males, and that they would on occasion have sex with them. That's not as true as it. We don't need to get into the details. It's not as true, but it certainly was a possibility, since the older males were training the younger males. Alcibiades was one of the students of Socrates, and to get a leg up on all the other students of Socrates, Alcibiades was the one who suggested that Alcibiades made sexual advances on Socrates to try to have sex with him to get a leg up on the other students. So this guy is very self-centered, willing to do whatever. And that kind of person can be, and that behavior is just not tolerated. then yeah, we can have more cooperation, partnership, equality, and the rest.
Thank you, Brian. That was really interesting. Especially, I think, I think part of the alpha male part is that if you're an alpha, like it, and this could be if you have, I'll just say if you have alpha energy, because I think, we talk about alpha females and alpha males, and they're more interested in domination than anything, but they're not happy with themselves. If you ever notice alpha males or alpha females, they're not really pleasant people to be around. So, I could see why it would be better, and I could see why even like you said, the baboons were like, well, we're not going to let this happen again. So, I think it's funny in that certain human societies that they won't let it happen, or they'll do their best to prevent it because they know it's not good. So thank you. Up next, I have Eleanor, followed by Joe. Eleanor, are you there?
Yes, sorry, I had problems to unmute. I was just asking myself how the world would look like if we wouldn't have divine feminine. I propose always for the balance, which is for me personally harmony. I don't think one-sided societies will thrive well. And even in countries where women are equal to the men, there are still places where females will not be really accepted. Therefore, it's very interesting. I have such an idea that women cannot do every job. I don't feel like I can be an iron worker, for instance, or I don't feel like I want to do something really heavy physical. When I get older, I think it's just a little bit difficult to do heavy physical things. So I'm very thankful personally if there are places where men work, and I'm okay with them being just all men there, because I know I will never do this job. I would prefer be paid the same amount for the same job as my coworker. This would be amazing. And I would love to have more support for all women when they grow children, because I think kids are taking a woman out of her career for a very long time. And sometimes in our society down the road today, it's not common that people stay together. So there is no warranty then that you have a second half who is providing for you. So I would love to have a system where women are generally being supported if they have children. Doesn't matter if they're married or not, included their children. And kind of getting better back into the life after the kids are out of house. So yeah, diversity and tolerance towards each other is what I would go for, and maybe same payment for same type of jobs.
Thank you, Eleanor. Up next, I have Joe.
I think Brian actually made a very good point when he spoke earlier, specifically with the idea of labeling. I think anytime that you start to label a behavior and in some way that it's going to be put in some kind of category, and then it's almost always othered in a way. So from that perspective, that the things, there are clearly differences, obviously, between the masculine and feminine. But when we start labeling the behaviors of doing something that would be maybe just as being feminine or masculine, I think that makes it a lot more difficult to present a solution sometimes, or to actually, instead of people evaluating the idea, they're evaluating the label or the behavior itself. So I think that is an important point whenever you're talking about, and in the West in particular, they have a tendency to want to label things. So I think that this is, it's a challenge to introduce feminine qualities into a culture that is actually, if you're focused on materialism and things along those lines, that the divine feminine is something that is kind of obviously lost, and I think we could benefit from kind of having a new reverence for feminine qualities. But I think that this is a multifaceted problem. I think there's a lot of other things that get factored in when you're trying to resurrect the concept of the divine feminine. Anyway.
Thank you, Joe. If anybody else has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Otherwise, Brian, if you're ready to move on, we can.
Okay. Before I lose them, I'll make a couple other quick points. I think they'll come up again. In addition to balance and health, which I think are important qualities of life that are nurtured by these, by pursuing cooperation, partnership, and the rest. The continuity is also important. And that just, I really haven't put a name to it, but that's over time, maintaining continuity. And that's how, so I think that the change actually needs to be, and is in fact ongoing. Yes, there are tipping points and all of that, but I think we can avoid the more violent revolutionary type changes if we have a more continuous transformation. I'll just leave it at that. And then the other thing is that, I do think I said, and I think there is something worthwhile in looking at these values, cooperation and the rest, and saying that they're not feminine, but also there's some implicit lesson, I think, in these wisdom traditions when these qualities and values are embodied. And the implicit lesson is that they're not going to be manifested on earth unless you do it. If we don't have people doing these things, they don't exist. And it's incumbent on each of you to think about that in your own lives. Okay, shall we go on to the next? Let's see.
Yes.
All right. This is also, I think it's, I didn't really consider it so important when I first listened to this interview, but I thought on reflection that it is important, and really in some ways kind of central because it focuses on the difference between this peaceful transformations and violent suppression. It also raises a difference that was important in the early Christian church, the difference between a religion that's practiced informally in small groups, which is the way the goddess worship tended to unroll, and the monumental types of religious practice in large cathedrals and other temples and other large centers that were more common in with the God-oriented worships. There's an evolution in both of them. There's kind of in earlier days, there was definitely a difference. So let's listen to this. Why is the divine feminine insufficiently manifested today? And you're going to hear her say, because it was violently suppressed, she's not the only one to say that.
Revolution Radio proudly presents.
For that. That was a very clear, concise, and thorough answer, and got me about 20 more questions. But
Go for it.
well, I can't help. The first thing that comes to mind is how long the suppression of the divine feminine has been going on, and I can't help but think back to. Well, let's put it this way. About a year or so ago, I did a class called "What if Sex was Sacred Sexuality," and it all had to do with the goddess and how over the last, a couple thousand years, that the female form has been looked upon as dirty, as evil. Whether we want to say it started at during the Garden of Eden and the apple and the rib and all that nonsense, or was it after the Council of Nicaea that really took control of society? What are your thoughts on the historical aspects of the suppression of the goddess, and how much of this how shall we say crisis do we need to overcome? I mean, this is a psychological crisis as a society that we're living through.
Yes, great question, Bernard. Thank you so much. Yes, I would say roughly the suppression of the feminine face of the divine starts with the emergence of the Abrahamic traditions going back to the first millennium BC. And of course, when you look at the Torah in Judaism, you see many passages where the prophets would always admonish, the Hebrew men to not go into any temples and worship, the Canaanite fertility goddess. God forbid they would do that. So that there is definitely, and of course, then when monotheism was strictly enforced, which now, according to most recent scholarship, didn't really happen until the late 7th century BC, then, everything that was, goddess worship going back to the Babylonian time, the great goddess Ishtar, Inanna, or Asherah was just oppressed. And then, interesting though, during the time of Jesus Christ, Jesus himself, as you know, was all inclusive and was actually really the last friend of the feminine, so to speak, in the Christian tradition. Theologians agree. And also, when he prayed to God, he used the Aramaic word Abun Bashmaya, which does not mean God the Father. It's actually God as a parent. So it includes both the father and the mother. And eventually then, as we know, the mother aspect of God got literally lost in translation, or it was, of course, deliberately omitted when Christianity in the 2nd century CE became a religion exclusively managed by men. And that had not been the case. In early Christianity, we had great diversity. Women were allowed to preach the gospel. They would go out and travel. They would take on leadership leadership positions in these communities of, early Christianity. So patriarchy in Christianity wasn't strictly enforced until, I would say, starting in the 2nd century CE, and then, of course, especially in the 3rd and 4th century, when Christianity became literally an imperial religion, took on the paradigms of the Roman Empire, and pretty much the church would enforce this one and only doctrine, considered the absolute truth, and everything else was oppressed as heresy, as you know.
You brought up a very good point, and actually an aspect of our history that many people don't seem to understand. And perhaps if you can expand on my comment here, I don't think even I understood the reach of the patriarchal Catholic Church in our Western society and our culture, especially throughout Europe during, well, I don't even know when, the Middle Ages, perhaps even before and a little bit after. Yeah. So when you say an imperial religion, I don't think people understand that the kings had to be in alignment with the Pope. The Pope basically controlled the kings of all the kingdoms.
Yes.
Could you explain that a little bit to the layman that may not understand how far-reaching it really was?
Yes, absolutely. And that's true. It was, the Pope was just like any other of the, so-called Christian kings in the Middle Ages. He would engage in power policies. Popes would, wage wars to defend the territory, the church state around Rome. That was all part, of the Middle Ages and, into the Renaissance and early modern history. But what I also want to say is, to just pick up on the church theme, that the demonization of women's bodies, and especially also their sexuality, started with the so-called tradition of the church fathers, who, when you write how they perceived women, it's truly gory. It's like, as you said, women are more prone to sin because of their childbearing function. Their bodies are close to nature, and as you know, nature was viewed as being corrupted because the original sin had entered the world through a tree and a snake, and of course through the woman, the sinful woman. So all women were looked upon as the daughters of Eve, the sinful first woman. And this misogyny, or contempt for women, peaked in the late 15th century, when a book was published with the blessing of the Pope at that time, called The Witch Hammer, where women were accused of witchcraft because the witch hunters would argue that, well, they are prone to the seduction of the devil because, they engage in sinful sexuality, and their bodies are closer to nature. So, they are inferior to spirit. There was that spirit matter split or spirit body split. And so they would accuse those women of engaging in sexual intercourse with the devil and all sorts of other things, like killing newborn babies or, destroying the crops. And a lot of midwives who were ancient, who were women who carried ancient wisdom like herbal healing and were able to assist women with the pains of childbirth, were demonized and looked upon as witches, and were accused because they were suspicious, because they possessed this ancient healing knowledge. And mostly it was, of course, elderly women. It was partly also for economic reasons. They may have a little home and garden, and of course the church was interested in their property, so it was simply confiscated. So that's all part of it. And this whole problem of sexuality and not honoring the female body and the womb, and of course, the sexuality, in the broader sense, has its roots in some of these notions that have been passed down to us through organized religion, I should say.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So why is the divine feminine insufficiently manifest today? She talked a lot about that. The one fact I would add is that the witch trials that came out of the this book, Hammer of the Witches. Sometimes it's called Hammer of the Witches, sometimes Witches Hammer. And it was written by two bishops, one sitting in Salzburg, Austria, and another one sitting in Cologne, Germany. Of course, those are the current political configurations, but sitting in those cities. And basically sitting on the borders of the Germanic nations that still had some traditional European wisdom. And a lot of that was embodied in women along the lines that was flagged by Isabella. I think people can appreciate that a bit more now, having studied the wisdom traditions in the book written by Isabella, that women have often been provided the nurturing and healing and developed tremendous know-how in those areas. That was this knowledge they possessed was beyond was really quite if you will, was very powerful, miraculous. They could do things outside of the power of the church, and so that made them heretics. And they it was not a small thing. 35 to 50,000 witches were tried and executed in Northern Europe beginning in the 1200s BCE. So that's kind of a big deal. And that's that also happened when the Spaniards came to the New World. There were matrilineal cultures in Central America, North America, engaging in practices that were considered demonic. And so they were just eliminated. So I think I was going to leave this out initially because I didn't consider it essential to the consideration of the divine feminine, but I guess now I think I do, because to me it's an example of the really an essential difference between the a religion or a mentality that includes the divine feminine and those that do not, and that is this violent suppression. I think there is a force in the world called violent suppression, and it typically has been exercised by men. So it's not unfair to call it a masculine trait, but that in itself, I think, in some ways, is the antithesis of the divine feminine. So if we're going to get away from it, if we're going to reintegrate the divine feminine, we need to get away from violent transitions and more gentle, nurturing, not fighting, negotiating, and on and on and on. So I did leave this in for that, primarily for that reason, because I think this has really been a persistent dynamic for a very long time, since the Indo-Europeans invaded different parts of the Middle East and Europe. So a very long time, since about 5,000 BCE, and it's I think it's something that needs to be addressed if we're going to, if the divine feminine, addressing this issue is the manifestation of the divine feminine in the world. So that's my opinion. And if other people would like to say something, that would be appreciated. Is Zeminique there?
I'm here. I'm right here. So if anybody has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat. Looks like Joe was first.
Yeah, to those comments in particular, I think there's power in suppressing or oppressing any group. And I think that there's different reasons and different institutions that do that. And I do think that her assessment is accurate, in that there is a certain level of control being exacted over women's rights in a number of ways. And if you go back even to the turn of the century, we can go back to some basic rights like voting and things like that, but just the ability to be independent of men. And then you start to see that kind of revolution come along. And you start to see power structures start to lose their power. So they have a vested interest in actually controlling women and their career opportunities and their bodies. And so I do believe that is something that is I think there's a lot of factors that go into this. I think they're more towards the economic end of things, but which is a form of power. I also think that religion's a tool within that framework. I think it's a valid point, and I think that a return to the divine feminine would take a lot of work, and I think it's that women have actually made a lot of progress, but it's something that we're very far from becoming a feminine culture. I do think that there's another issue. I think that this may be, I have nothing to support this other than my observations, but in a way, we've become such a masculine culture that once, in a way, I feel like we're making women more masculine. I know that that's maybe not fair, but I think that that's our culture right now. And so that takes a lot of thought as to how to make progress in that area.
Thank you, Joe. Up next, I have Paul, followed by Penny.
Hi, thanks, Evanique. Important discussions, obviously. I think one way we might sort of gain perspective is by reminding ourselves of the fact that the wisdom teachings are deep, as Srikant always reminds us. And for instance, the group that is studying the Gospel of John are taking words that others might have turned into power structure things that abused women and all people, and understanding that underneath those words is something important. And there were periods, I would propose, in history when these traditions that have become institutionalized in very difficult to understand in bad ways weren't like this slide represents, just for historical perspective. I'm reminded of the conflict between Judaism and Islam, for instance. And then nobody remembers that for 1,000 years, the Jews and the Muslims walked by each other every day and lived with their teachings that seemed like they were completely opposed and violent without any of that. So there's a lot of depth to the words. And the point I want to make about the perspective is, and Joe's talking about the universality of some woman being encouraged to be masculine, is the tendency is this wiring of ego. that every person, every human has, that leads to the need for power. And as like Bucky says, gain resources. And so if you're getting into that self-centered, I need power and resources, it's sort of gender independent. And you might see a queen do it in England, or you might see a king do it, but it doesn't mean that it isn't easily messed up in the male mind, because it is. But it's just a good perspective that these deep wisdom teachings have a lot of the answers, even though some things got built up onto them because of the problem of ego that did very terrible things. And it was the most powerful one situation. But the teachings themselves aren't inherently impossible to gain diversity, inclusion, all the good things from. And secondly, that we all have this battle of the ego that wants control, which is associated with violent suppression in a way that we all have to fight. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it. Up next, I have Penny.
I just wanted to comment on the issue about that book, the Witch Hammer and the Witch Trials, because, you know, I'm pretty well acquainted with the suppression of the church of women, but I really hadn't realized the importance and the significance of like the witch trials. And it was a way to remove women who had knowledge that the church didn't want, and also to confiscate their properties. And I didn't realize actually that it had started so early, the 1200s BCE, because I mean, it even continued when, you know, America was a young country and we had the famous Salem witch trials and things like that. And I'm sure it's a reflection of the same attitude toward women. And I was just kind of struck by the fact that this had been something that was institutionalized so many, you know, like a couple thousand years before the founding of America, and it was still going on.
Thank you, Penny. Up next, I have Eleanor.
Hi. So I'm a little bit off topic maybe today, but I'm having a little bit problem to excuse myself with witch trials as a woman. I don't want to go so far back. I understand and I agree on it, but I'm living now and today, and I do believe it's possible to turn over the traditions if the system, such as church and politicians, are going to do it so, if they want. But everyone has to be on the same page and work towards it. It has to be clear that there are goals and there's a plan. Of course, it takes a couple of years for, let's say, after the Second World War. I even observed it on my mom that she has a little bit different mindset, and she was born shortly after Second World War, basically. And a woman who was basically aligned with a certain type of system needs to be more believe in herself again, that she is responsible for certain things and she can. And it's given to her again to make decisions. So that takes a couple of years to align back again, to make females believe that they are caring for themselves, that they are providing for themselves. But there is also a downside to it, because when it's very equal, it's nice, but I have such an idea that we will be paying off with our femininity. Because in some countries where where it's more equal, women are more masculine. and they have less children. Because in our system today, we have to choose if we want children or career. We cannot really survive on just one salary. It's possible, but it's not given to us to a normal, let's say, normal earning human being to live okay if you have, let's say, 2 kids. And I'm just thinking very modern. I'm not going even backwards to the witches, you know. It's difficult to raise children in a system where you got half paid before, and then you have to stop your career, and then you have to restart again when you're older. So, and then the men don't feel committed to you too, because we are living in a society where everyone can have multiple women too, you know, and no one is obligated to marry you anymore. So, which is all nice, but we have to adjust the system so it serves us if we want feel better. And it's possible. The politicians and the religion have to want, they have to do it. And we have kind of like move forward.
Thank you, Elena. If anybody else has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat. Otherwise, Brian, whenever you're ready, we can move forward.
Well, I'll just say I appreciated the comments from Paul and Eleanor, especially this comment on ego. I hadn't really contemplated that. It brings a whole new perspective to the discussion. We've talked a bit about, you know, the time needed for changes and time frames. So I kind of, while we were doing that, I noted that there's evidence of, and this is just to point out, you know, to take a broader view on all of this, you know, the period of time that we're focusing on now that was mentioned by Isabella and trying to answer the question from Bernard Alvarez is really focusing on, at least as regards Christianity, from 400 BCE to about today. So that's about 1600 years. And I think most people believe outside of the steppe in Eurasia that the feminine goddess dominated for not hundreds or thousands, but tens of thousands of years before that. So we're kind of in an era, and it is quite possible that there will be some changes and rebalancing, and it'll probably, as people have been flagging, it's going to take some time. But I'm very interested in that question of ego. Okay, let's go back and look at this. The next question, the sacred marriage, which I think I really like because I think there's a lot of focus on individual quest and going it alone, and what do I get and what do I have to do? It's all, you know, mine, me, mine, and a lot. It's just a lot of that, even in the religions. And you know, I'm not saying it's bad, but I think you could add to it the things that can be done together, which I like, and that's the idea I like with the sacred marriage, is just working together in teams or groups and as appropriate in the circumstance. And sacred marriage has been something that was identified in the goddess traditions that really did bring together the masculine and the feminine when people were understanding many of these forces, psychic, cosmic, and the rest, these divine matters in terms of male and female. They were personifying them exclusively, and to capture the concept of wholeness and completeness and the need of working together and the rest, and the sacred and balance and harmony in continuity. The sacred marriage was an essential ritual. So let me just play that for a minute, because I think that Isabella Price has a very important take on that.
My goodness, we've only got about 5 minutes left. I can go for another 2 hours. But speaking of that, there is something to be said for the balance of masculine divinity and feminine divinity. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite holidays in the pagan calendar, the Wheel of the Year, is Beltane, and the sacred rite of, the image of the god and the goddess in sexual union is a part of that. Whereas, the earth mother connects with the sky father in order to fertilize the earth and, to bring the crops and bring life forth, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder how this ancient concept of the sacred marriage plays into our modern culture.
Yes, that's a great question. Well, as you say, it has ancient roots going back to Mesopotamia when the king was ritually wedded to the goddess who actually endorsed him in his power for another year, but it was also to, of course, ensure an abundant harvest. Now, how does that ritual still make sense to our modern times, and how can we apply it? What are the inspirations? I would just talk about the sacred marriage within us. And that's the union and integration of both the healthy archetypal masculine with the healthy feminine. And we have to understand that the masculine and feminine, we have to dissociate those terms from gender. I think this is a very important thing to prevent misconceptions. So that means all of us, regardless of gender, have all these archetypes, these qualities and energies available within us, the whole range, psychologically and energetically speaking. So what we need is a sacred marriage, a union of both the masculine and the feminine, reclaiming the sacred in both of them. And that will not only heal ourselves and make us cool human beings, healed human beings, but it will put us into alignment with our beautiful planet and all the other life forms with whom we share, and also the world at large. And that means, of course, implementing those values rooted in God's wisdom cultures that I mentioned before. And I feel also, to perhaps conclude, that it's very important that especially we women step it up at this critical evolutionary threshold. That's why I was so exhilarating for me to march, at the Women March recently and feel the vibe, the healthy revolutionary spirit. And it was very empowering, psycho-spiritual, because I feel that we women together in partnership with conscious men like you and others who are supporting us, we have to step it up as feminine co-creators. I'm now adopting a term that Barbara Marx Hubbard coined, the evolutionary visionary. And this is like a co-creative dance in partnership with the divine, with spirit, that we have to also give our highest contribution. We have to help to make it happen, because it's not just going to happen all by itself. There's not this old sugar daddy up in the sky, the sky father looking down and doing some miraculous interventions to just create this new world that we all yearn to see. We have to do our part as well. So this is the co-creative dance. And here is where Barbara Marx Hubbard also comes in with her notion of the feminine co-creator, but I believe it has to happen in cooperation and partnership with the sacred masculine, with conscious man.
Beautifully stated. Thank you. I'm lucky. I'm happy to say we got about.
Okay, let me go back now. So the sacred marriage within us, I think that's the point that is being highlighted by Isabella Price. The sacred marriage is a union. It's a balance and a harmony of the masculine and feminine aspects in each of us. And I thought she spoke, that really struck me when I heard her say that. I wasn't expecting her to have that take on it. So I'd just like to open it up for comments.
If anybody has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat. I just wanted to say, because I know we're coming to the end tonight, that this overall, and I just want to speak to the whole series that we did on Isabella Price. I think it was amazing. I think it was a great opener to the Divine Feminine series. And I think we covered so many different cultures and so many different aspects. And I think I want to comment on one more thing, which is the sacred marriage is the union, balance, and harmony of the masculine and feminine aspects in each of us. And I just think that's the biggest takeaway for me, is that it's a union, it's a balance, and it's a harmony within me. And, I can choose how I want to be. And I think that's a beautiful thing, that you choose this. You get to choose this. No matter what's going on the outside, you get to choose who you're going to be. And, this is a beautiful, I think, way to be. And that's what's impacted me the most. And you can see it in all the feminine icons that we have studied, is the masculine and feminine aspects. You saw the fierceness of the goddesses. God help you if you mess with their children, or God help you if you mess with their husbands. They were not going to sit down and take it quietly. But at the same time, it really is a true balance. So thank you, Brian, for doing this with us. Thank you so much for this presentation tonight. I thought the video was a great way to end the series on Isabella Price, and just to really summarize it up in her own words. So thank you.
You're welcome. I hope that there's some people hanging on. There's a couple there. We can discuss the sacred marriage. There's a couple more important points coming up in the interview.
So up next we have Joe.
Yeah, I mean, the sacred marriage to me is it's a return to a balance, right? That currently doesn't exist. So where there's a balance and healthy respect for the feminine and the masculine. And as individuals, I think we could actually work towards this. But in societally, it gets a little harder, I will say. It gets a little bit more complex. But I do like, I think it's, she put it beautifully. So, I just wanted to add that. It did surprise me a little bit, though.
Brian, are you there?
Yes, I thought, does anyone else have comments?
Penny.
I just wanted to say, I was surprised too when she started talking about the sacred marriage and talked about it as something that was happening within you as an individual. But I just wanted to say, it seems, that if you accept like the equality of yourself as, combining the masculine and feminine characteristics, then that would solve a lot of issues for each of us and for society, because if you accept, that each of these is essential for all of us, then I think that there would be a lot less suppression of, the feminine side of society, which the patriarchal religions and political structures, etc., have set up.
Thank you, Penny. That was beautiful. Does anyone else have? Let me just make sure. If anyone else has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat. Hearing none, Brian, where are we going next?
Okay, I just make one last comment. Again, I think you made a really important point that if we just say that, again, looking back, into history and tradition, it's just these are examples that we can draw on for possibly having lessons for how to behave today. But our attitudes and behaviors today, I think the sacred marriage was going way back, it was an example of bringing together everything that was necessary to get the job done or to do things. And it was bringing all of the characteristics to bear, some of which were characterized as male, some by female, but in bringing together male and female, the belief was they brought together all the necessary characteristics and were embodied in that union. And so that's the kind of wholeness that Isabella is pointing at and was talking about. Carl Jung also talks about that sort of thing. Individuation means real, and becoming whole is realizing all aspects of yourself, including the shadow, the male and the female. So I think that the sacred marriage is, it's a great lesson that I think points to that calls us to try to become more whole and complete. So the pitfalls for manifesting the divine feminine today, that's the last topic. And I think it is important because it makes some of the points that that Paul and especially Eleanor were making earlier. Let's see. All right.
Revel.
Going to say we got about 2 more minutes, so I have one last question to ask you, and I do feel it's a very important question because I have seen where, especially when we're all excited about a new concept or a new philosophy, we really cling to it and we really, what's the word? Proselytize it, for lack of a better term, to the point of annoyance, quite honestly. And I feel that can be a pitfall. What are some of the pitfalls that we can look at that we should be aware of when we're dealing with the concept of the divine feminine?
Great question. And there are clearly pitfalls. Well, one is, as I just mentioned, if we are not able to dissociate the feminine and the masculine from gender. And a lot of men, I know they still have that notion in their head that the goddess is only for women, and nothing could be further from the truth, because her energy expresses herself, I say, in all creative endeavors, in the innovation. If you write a book, whatever you do, she's the creative impulse, Shakti, driving evolution. So it's in men, it's in all of us. Our intuition also, I think, is very important. Comes, it's more also in the right part of our brain, and to really tune into the mother's energy, it's important that we also find a balance between left and right brain. But again, she's in all of us. So pitfall would be to say, well, it's only for women, the goddess. That's one thing. The other thing is, if we get too much stuck in some pre-modern notions of her that were okay, thousands of years ago when we had, horticultural societies, and after the transition into farming and domestication of animals, some of these bird goddesses, snake goddesses. I mean, that's all wonderful, but we shouldn't be stuck there, because otherwise it's just like another concept, and we don't need more concepts. So it's important to really have this wide, broad view, and to just see that the mother is both, she's nurturing, benevolent, but she's also the fierce mother, she's form, but she also goes beyond form. I mean, that really is a pitfall, being stuck in these pre-modern notions of the divine feminine.
That's a great answer. And actually, one of my pet peeves, I used to joke with my friends of in South Florida in the pagan culture, the pagan community. I was like, we have to realize that we're living in the 20th century. Back then it was the 20th century. I was like, we're not living, we all used to go to the Renaissance Fair. I love the Renaissance Fair, but we weren't trying to recreate the Middle Ages. I wouldn't want to recreate the Middle Ages. We want the modern concept of the goddess. We want the modern 21st century aspects and align with what she can do today. I think would be a great way to look at it.
Okay, so this is the last slide. She's pointing out some of the pitfalls. Oh, I have a typo here on my slide. It should be male and female. But it's really making some of the points that I think especially Eleanor was making, but others have alluded to. But it's really, I think these last two comments from Isabella are calling for us to use the wisdom traditions that focused on the goddess in our own lives as appropriate today, and to make us aware of powers that we have, powers of cooperation, equality, and the rest. Those are rather inspirational, I think, inspirational values and principles, and can have real force in the world. And then the other is seeking to manifest in the present and future, not with an attachment to the past. And so that's also Paul. I think Paul and Eleanor were both saying, let's look to the future, and Isabella, I think, is very much in agreement with that. So that's my comments. Anybody else?
Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is kind of where I was going a little bit earlier with this separating the masculine and the feminine from the identification with genders. It's that the not to recognize the differences, but at the same time, I think labeling something as feminine and labeling something as masculine is just highly problematic. And I think that doesn't necessarily allow us to move towards a culture that is thinking more in terms of an idea versus a label of what the idea supposedly represents. And I think that's like, and I'm just saying in general, if somebody says you're acting, you're not necessarily being tough enough or something along those lines, you're all of a sudden, labeled as something feminine, and that is associated with not being firm, where Isabella Price actually just spoke about, look, women can both be firm and caring. So that kind of, it's the associations that we make with these labels that I think are a big obstacle. Anyway.
Thank you, Joe. If anyone else has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat. I think one of the main pitfalls, I agree with Isabella, is that the failing to separate the masculine and feminine from identification with genders, male and female, because I think we can say, oh, females don't have that quality. And absolutely, we can be, we can have those qualities. And I think that's the mistake we've made in the past, is that we kind of say, oh, well, a feminine, like I always look at it as energy and balance, like from the previous slide. And so I think the key here is balance, and that, even, and I think I agree with Joe, what he said earlier, is like when you label things, you're othering them. So I think we just kind of look at it as energy, right? I think Jordan Peterson, order and chaos, right? You need both, but you need an imbalance, and sometimes they need to work together in order to create something, right? Chaos is very creative, but you need the order, but you also need the idea. So I think that's key too. And so we have that both, right? Um, you know, so I think, and another thing where it says here, to seek the manifest of the divine feminine and commitment to the present and the future. I think too, you can bring it in the present by bringing it within yourself, and you can bring it in the future by being the example to others, by just being who you are, or being who you choose to be, and choosing it consciously. I think that's a great example. I have friends in my life that are great examples of this, and I learn from them every day, and they make me a better person just by being around them. So to me, that's that key, is that energy that they have, and that's something you can manifest.
It is another point that I picked up recently, is that yes, in the Indian tradition, the Indic tradition, the power, the force for creation, sustenance, and transformation, they're all come from women. The force is coming from women. It's divine. There is the divine force. That divine force, all divine force, is feminine. I thought that's my understanding of it, and that's more or less the way Isabella explained it this evening.
Thank you. Up next, we have Penny.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, kind of in general, after reading this book, that the goddess power, just the kind of role that we don't want to be committed to the past. But I think that if society and people have more of an understanding about past civilizations and the role that society played in these goddess cultures, which were more egalitarian and cooperative, then I think that helps lay the framework for moving into the future, because I think we have been raised to kind of believe that the present system is the best system, and it's the way that things should be. And just having a little bit of an understanding, and this is one thing they have talked about in the books too, that even the history was suppressed. But if people realize that there were thousands of years of history in which societies were more cooperative, then I think it helps to be able to take that next step forward.
Thank you, Penny. Brian, any closing thoughts?
No, except I thought I really also got a lot out of reading and presenting. Together with you, Evanique also made several presentations, as did Penny. Presenting this book, it's really, for me, it's been a tremendous experience. I hope that it's benefited others in some way.
I'm sure. I think it has. I think a lot of people who maybe couldn't attend also watched it on YouTube. So, you know, I think it did. I'm absolutely sure it did. Joe.
Yeah, I also want to thank, you know, Evanique, Brian, Penny, Rupali as well, for all the efforts that went into this series. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of work. You know, I remember it was about what, maybe in November. Brian, I mean, gave an incredible presentation, and I was actually noting to Penny through the chat, and I was just like, it was just remarkable, and Penny reminded me that you're a university professor, but it was still remarkable. So in any case, it was really an effort of love, and I'm very much appreciative of your time every Friday night. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate all the efforts that everybody gave. So yeah, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome. We'll be considering also how to move forward, I think, right?
Yeah,
That would be great.
Yeah, I think we still have the Joseph Campbell presentation that you did, Brian. We can't let that go.
I thought I would be glad to do that.
Yeah, I think you did all. I mean, you've done a lot of the work already, so it seems like a easy flow into it. I think it was all supposed to be a part of one presentation. Me and Penny
would be one session's turning into 3.
Yeah, me and Penny laughed about that one. We were like, we were supposed to get through 3 of those at once, and we didn't make it off the first one. So yeah, so I think that's just a natural progression. I mean, you've already done the work, and I think that could be next month.
I will say, you know, this is really now a postscript, but the Maria Gimbutas work is also in itself. She goes back to the Paleolithic, and you know, the feminine, the female. This is again kind of going away from what we've been talking, but in that era, I can just imagine that the human body was so important, because this was coming out of the Ice Age. It was a hostile environment. There were big hostile animals, saber-toothed tigers, and all of this, and the plants weren't necessarily growing. If you could catch a fish, I guess that wouldn't be too hostile, but the weather, the animals, everything was very hostile. And I can imagine having, you know, a family in a cave or some other very small enclosure was a very important part of life. And the human body, the woman giving birth to children, was so important. The you know, then when the ice melted and the earth became a little more hospitable and opened up, things changed. But I could just imagine that era that she's writing about, when living together in close quarters, the hearth, the domestic skills, all that stuff was so important, and was really I guess deified in these very early forms of appreciation of the goddess. And I think that's something that we just haven't, you know, and I probably won't entirely get away from.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. So I will just say what's coming up really fast. Just give you some events. I know tomorrow night at 5 p.m. Jason will be giving a presentation. I'm just pulling it up right now. Sorry, I should have been prepared, guys. He's is going to be studying Suzy. I can't pronounce that. And
Sun
it's the
Tzu.
butterfly, huh?
I'm sorry. I thought you were talking Art of War. Forgive me. I interrupted you.
No worries. I think it's pronounced Schwanzi, Butterfly Dream, and that's tomorrow at 5 p.m. On Sunday at a special time, just make a note, 1 p.m. Rupali Rupali will be giving a talk on educational thought of Maria Montessori and Buckminster Fuller, and that will be at 1 p.m. on Sunday. And on Monday, there's the poetry discussions. On Tuesday, there's a continuing study of the art of war. Wednesday, I don't think we have anything set for that yet. Usually something with Sanjay on that week, right, Joe?
That is correct.
Yeah. So I don't know what that is yet. Thursday, we're going to do Jabril. We're going to continue our study of that. So right now on Thursdays, we alternate between the Gospel of John and the poetry by Jabril. And so we will be doing that. And then Friday, I'm personally just happy about this one because it's one of my best friends, Jamie Feinberg. She will be present. I will be posting it either tonight or tomorrow morning. But she's going to talk. We're going to have our Design Your Life series, and she's going to talk about crafting her own life adventure. She is a younger woman who has really crafted her own life. She in her, I want to say in her early 30s, she decided that she wanted to travel around the country. So she and her husband Ross bought an RV and traveled across the country for 5 years. So she's going to talk about that. And now she has a coaching business and she's teaching people how to do that. And among other things, she also teaches Enneagram studies and positive intelligence. So she's going to talk about how she crafted her life and her adventures in RVing. So that's what's going to be the topic next Friday at 8 p.m. and looking forward to it. So thank you.
Thank you all. And everyone who's persevered, and Evanique for giving us the update.
So thank
you for persevering with us.
Yeah. I think I'm preaching to the choir at this point. So
yeah,
it's not perseverance and enjoyment.
Yes.
With all of you. So it's always a pleasure to see you guys. All right.
Yeah, you too.
Have a great week if I don't see you.
Yeah. Have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.